I was paid $100,000 to oversee a psychological experiment. The money wasn't worth it. The advertisement popped up on the side of my screen as I was browsing through some unrelated trashy entertainment site. $6,000 dollar for your participation in a clinical study. Apply online today. In all honesty, it looked like a scam. The branding was tacky and looked at least a decade out of date. The emphasis on the dollar signs was funny, and my instincts told me not to click on the little blue link to the application page because it was probably a phishing scheme. Still, though, I was bored out of my mind since losing my job a few weeks prior and thought it couldn't hurt much more than similarly sketchy stuff I'd clicked on in the past. Maybe I could even actually make some money. The link took me to a page with the same outdated vibe as the advertisement and a form to fill out personal details as well as things like why I would be the ideal person for the position. I'm a curious person, so I wanted to see where this led and decided to create an email address specifically for signing up and input a slightly modified version of my real name. I went about the rest of my evening and forgot about it all until the next morning when an email came through. It congratulated me on being selected for participation, and after a ton of boring spiel listed an address on the other side of town as the site of the study. I was invited to be there at 8 a.m. the next day and told that all would be explained upon arrival. Well, the next morning rolled around pretty quickly. I drove across town and arrived at an unnaturally white, sterile-looking building with no windows in sight and only a single door. I walked in and was greeted by an older man with a wispy gray beard who said he was the head of the study and lead researcher and asked me to take a seat in the office behind him. He went over the online form and sign-up process to confirm I was where I was supposed to be, asked for my ID, and then went on to explain what I was there for. To my surprise, he also told me that they had struggled immensely in finding a suitable candidate and would actually be paying me a substantially increased $100,000 upon completion of my duties. That was enough to pay off my car and my home, payments I'd been falling ever behind on in recent weeks. Enough for me to finally live a modest yet stress-free life. It was a psychological experiment, designed to provide the researchers with some insight into the logical processes of individuals when given the choice between a larger individual gain or a more modest collective gain. 6 participants would be given a choice between $20,000 and $1 million. If every participant chooses the smaller, but still significant gain, they all win. If only one participant chooses the larger amount, they win the larger amount and every other participant loses. If more than one participant chooses the larger amount, all walk away with nothing. All participants are made aware of these rules at the beginning of the experiment. At its core, it was an experiment on human selfishness and human togetherness. Or, even more simply, the proclivity of the human mind to gamble a smaller gain for a larger one. By the time it was all explained to me and I had signed the various consent forms and NDAs, it was midday and I was informed the experiment would be beginning. I was taken into an isolated room with camera footage of similar rooms presented on an array of television screens on the wall ahead of my admittedly comfy-looking chair. My role was to observe, nothing more. I was not introduced to any of the participants. I did not recognize any of them, and I was not involved in the logistics of the experiment in any manner other than watching those screens and noting down everything I saw. I was wished good luck. The door was quite oddly locked behind me, and the experiment began. Each participant had 2 buttons in front of them, one with the lower amount of cash signaled on it and the other with the higher amount. They each had 10 minutes to press a button and were encouraged to take their time and take mental note of their thought process for the eventual decision. Participant 4 was the first to make their decision, almost immediately pressing the button labeled $1 million. Well, that didn't take long. I muttered under my breath while scrawling down notes on the apparent enthusiasm of the man. The remaining subjects took their time and seemed to consider their decisions much more. As I had suspected from their supposed hesitation, the others all elected to go for the lower, safer amount in a show of trust for their fellow participants. The 10-minute timer wound down to 0 and a loud buzzing sound played simultaneously through every screen I was watching. My eyes eagerly awaited any movement, but the participants all sat still and were also waiting. Not long after, the man who had welcomed me earlier walked into the room of the subject who chose the higher amount, presumably to congratulate him on being the only one to take that risk and escort him out of the premises into his newfound status as extremely wealthy. That wasn't what happened. I watched as the outwardly gentle study lead was passed a baseball bat wrapped in thick barbed wire. The first swing made me physically recoil as if I were the one being hit. I threw up all over my meticulously taken notes and lost count not long after that. Blood spewed across the room and brain matter was strewn across the remnants of the subject's body. They had beaten him with that bat until barely anything remained. He was unrecognizable. Nothing but a pulp of freshly exposed meat and bones. I looked at the other screens to see the remaining participants sitting as still as they had ever been, none the wiser to what had happened. Eventually, the man made his rounds to each of their rooms, and they were escorted away from the view of my cameras. Considering the rules were horribly breached with participant number 4, I wasn't exactly hopeful they were given their freedom. But who knows? By the time my camera feeds were devoid of any participants less the bloody pulp on feed 4, I had gone into a state of delirium. Begging, screaming, and crying in an effort to be let out of whatever this twisted game was. They let me stew in there for what felt like hours before the lead researcher finally came in. The realization of what this was all truly about came in the moments leading up to his arrival. The participants before my eyes were never the actual experiment I was. The offer of an increased payment was the true experiment. It was a test of what I would put up with for desperately needed cash. You see, I knew I could dismiss what I had seen and walk out of there with my reward. But that would have meant living with never telling a soul. Not the police, not my friends, nobody. Ever. Having the image of the thing that remained of that poor man etched into my mind, the blood-soaked, slimy hunk of meat berating my selfishness in an ironic display of anger. I protested and screamed with all my might. Told him I knew what this was all about. That he was a sick bastard and would get what he deserved. He stood there, unfazed. Like he knew I was secretly considering walking away with the money in the midst of my rage. That's exactly what I ended up doing. I don't remember much of what happened next, almost as if I'd been drugged. I do remember eventually accepting their offer of walking away, though. I woke up in my apartment and instinctively picked my phone up from the nightstand by my bed. The clock read 9 o'clock. The date was the day after my ordeal. My phone buzzed with a new notification. Redacted, bank, your deposit of $100,000 has been successfully processed. Thank you for your continued loyalty. The events of the day previous came back to me, and my body ran cold with both the primal fear of what I had witnessed and visceral disgust at my own actions. It has been a month since I took part in the experiment. My house is now wholly my property, as is my car. I have a comfortable life, and my lack of employment will no longer be a problem for at least a little while. But I can't live with what I saw any longer, with what I did. I can't go to the police yet, either. If they found my account to be true, I would be thrown in prison too. For now, I have to settle on telling my story anonymously, to at least somewhat rid myself of this tremendous guilt. I can't handle that pile of flesh and bones berating my decision any longer, terrorizing my every waking moment and waiting for me in every unconscious moment. I hope this can get it out of my mind.